folks, once more, the following are essential terms in order to understand the historical Paul and his project. Again, we're not talking about the Paul that often gets theologized and romanticized, praised, or debased today by many Christians and other people, but how he actually was in history. Without understanding these terms properly, Paul is simply inaccessible to you. Misunderstanding and distortion inescapably result. Therefore, in order to read Paul respectfully, let's go over these terms. Judeans, or Israelites. Biblically speaking, Judean is the proper translation for this Hebrew and this Greek word. Judean is the name for people dwelling in the territorial region called Judea, where the temple of the God of Israelites was located. It also referred to people who followed the ancestral customs of Israelites as practiced in Judea, émigré Judeans, that is, émigré Israelites. Judean refers to ancestral place of origin. In his letters, Paul never calls himself a Judean. However, he does claim Judean birth. For Paul, the world consists of Israelites and all other peoples, ta ethne, the outgroup, while his Israel consists of Judeans and Hellenes, misleadingly translated as Jews and Greeks. It was extremely difficult to distinguish a first-century Israelite from a non-Israelite in Paul's Mediterranean world. As Jewish scholar Shia Cohen observes, Israelites and non-Israelites, quote, were corporeally, visually, linguistically, and socially indistinguishable. First-century Israelite circumcision was really just a nick. It was neither an infallible nor a usable marker of Judean or Israelite identity. And if there were no genealogical records that would have proven who was an Israelite and who was not.
In fact, we know from Roman texts that people in the Roman world who did become newly rich and wanted to move up the social ladder hired genealogists to create fictive genealogies for themselves. And there were a few stars in the pantheon of Roman ancestors they all wanted to be associated with. For a fee, you could get that association.
And if the Israelites of antiquity looked just like everyone else, spoke just like everyone else, were named just like everyone else, and supported themselves like everybody else, how did one know an Israelite in antiquity when one encountered one? Cohen's observations, based on ancient Mediterranean documents, have little, if anything, to do with later post-Talmudic Jewish peoples, a genetically, culturally, and religiously diverse and rich reality. This is true in varying degrees, whether we are talking about Sephardim or other Jewish groups who do have some Semitic heritage, or if we are talking about the Ashkenazim, or European Jews, who are not Semitic, and who constitute the vast majority of modern Jewish people. And we know this thanks to historical scholarship from Israeli historians, such as Dr. Shlomo Sand, and genetic studies, such as those from Israeli-American geneticist Dr. Eran El-Hayek. Greeks, or Hellenes. Hellenes, often translated in the New Testament as Greeks, meant civilized, a characteristic of any person who spoke Hellenistic Greek, followed Hellenistic customs, and shared Hellenistic values and ideals. In the New Testament, Greek never refers to ethnicity. but always status. The reason why Greek referred to a status rather than to a people was because there was no Greece in the first century Mediterranean world. Mediterranean urban centers like Philippi and Thessalonica were located in Macedonia, while Corinth was located in Achaia. So, in Paul's New Testament times, there were Macedonians and Achaeans, but no Greeks. In the time of Paul, the term Greek always referred to a social status rather than geographical origin. In Paul's usage, Greek means the opposite of barbarian. So in the first century, there were no Greeks in any ethnic, nationalistic, or political sense. Thus, the term Greek in Israelite contexts, like Paul's writings, means an Israelite in-group generic designation for Israelite residents outside Judea living in Hellenistic areas. Among Israelites like Paul, Greek refers to Hellenized ancestral group members, or ancestral groups located in Hellenized Mediterranean urban centers. People of the Roman Empire, among whom Paul traveled, were very aware of a common set of categories that transcended their own local groupings or lineage. This common set of categories consisted in assessing the inhabitants of the world in terms of Greek or civilized, and barbarian. Empire-minded people were aware of being part of the Greco-Roman Empire, with its 3.5 million square kilometers being an island of civilization, surrounded by barbarians. In the perspective of these cosmopolitans, which included Romans and elites of other ethnic groups, all civilized people were Greeks, while the rest were barbarians, or some other subset known for something other than their level of humanness. Israelites, like everyone else, accepted this viewpoint. Again, among first-century Greeks, in this ancient sense of the word, it would be difficult to distinguish a Mediterranean Judean or Israelite from a Mediterranean non-Judean, as already discussed.
Now, what I want to clarify for you is the phrase Jew and Gentile never appears anywhere in the Bible. Jew and Gentile. Jew appears a lot because it's mistranslated. But wherever you see Gentile, it's a bad translation. So let me show you what the problem is. All Israelites formed an in-group. This in-group they recognized as consisting of 3 parts: Galileans, Judeans, and Pereans. Perea is the area across the Jordan River, nowadays called Jordan. So these are the 3 groups. If you look in the Gospel of Matthew, these are the 3 groups that make up the house of Israel. In fact, in Matthew's Gospel, that's where Jesus is always headed. To the house of Israel, I'm looking for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The house of Israel is how they call themselves. And when they call themselves this, they distinguish Judeans from Galileans and Pereans. That's inside language. Outsiders said, a Judean is a Judean is a Judean. So when the outsider Pilate wrote the sign for Jesus' crucifix, notice that people didn't object and say, don't put down Judean, he's a Galilean. We all know he's from Galilee. No, they recognize Pilate's not going to discriminate and distinguish. For him, one Judean is like another Judean. They're all Judeans because they all worship that God Yahweh whose temple is in Judea. So that's where their allegiance is, to that temple in Judea. They're all Judeans. So outgroups, they tend to do this all the time. they have a rather narrow perspective and just use that one word. So that's where the difficulty comes from. So when Paul, if you look, for instance, take a look at Romans 3:9. What then? Are we Jews any better off? No, not at all, but I have already charged that all men, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. So I'm reading from the Revised Standard Translation, but very likely whatever translation you are reading is the same, right? And when I said there, are we Jews any better off? You all have Jews, presumably. What should it be? All right, so now with your pencils, you got to go crossing out all those Jews in your Bible and put down Judeans, Judeans. Okay, now the next one. We have already charged that all men, both Jews and Greeks. Well, now as a matter of fact, Greece did not exist as Greece at that time. But the English word is Hellene, Hellene, H-E-L-L-E-N-E. Or you may have heard this word Hellenists. The synonym for that is civilized. These are cultured, civilized people. They observe civilized practices. They speak a language of some sort, but it's civilized. So everything I have there, Hellenes would be a person who was cultivated, not necessarily or exclusively Greek, and it should not be translated Greek, who spoke a common Hellenic language, the one that Alexander spread all over the world when he conquered in 300 BC, who practiced some Macedonian or Athenian or increasingly Roman customs. Macedon, as you know, is the northern part of Greece, right? And Athens is in the southern part, right? Okay. And Rome, you know where Rome is. So these were looked to as civilization centers. People who came from these areas were civilized. They were respected as civilized, intelligent people, and they behaved in what was considered a cultivated lifestyle. So when Paul is writing like Jews and Greeks, he's talking about Judeans and Hellenes. The best one that I want, go to 1 Corinthians 1:24. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. So my translation has those who are called Jews and Greeks. Probably have that too. Yeah, that is based on a very bad reading of a Greek manuscript. There are some Greek manuscripts that actually use that word, but the best Greek manuscripts, and I do have my Greek test, but it doesn't make sense for us to look at it, but in my Greek footnotes in my Greek text, it tells you that that's simply bad. The translator made a bad choice of a bad Greek word. The proper Greek word is the proper word for Hellenists or Hellenes. So Paul is writing to Israelites and Hellenes. Stumbling block to Israelites. What does this mean? I'm preaching that Jesus is Messiah. What am I preaching about him? That he was crucified. Well, that's nonsense. That God raised him from the dead? That's fabulous. That's spectacular, but bull. And so so Paul says, yes, it's a stumbling block to you Judeans. You don't get it. You have rejected him as Messiah. And you civilized people, not any better off. You don't think any better of this either. All right, the main point is Israelites and Hellenes, or Israelites and non-Israelites, but not Gentiles and certainly not Greeks. Okay, this is a tough one. Any questions about it? All right, it's just a question of getting accustomed to this new terminology and new way of thinking about it.
Non-Israelites, or Gentiles. These would include all other peoples in the first century world of Paul who were not Israelites. Again, for Paul, the world is either Israelite or non-Israelite, with many category divisions within Israel. Not so among non-Israelites, who are all of a piece, they or Gentile sinners. Contrary to popular belief, Paul had absolutely no interest in any of these peoples, and he was not really an apostle to the Gentiles. Instead, Paul was authorized by the God of Israel to disseminate his innovation or gospel of God to Israelite immigrants living among non-Israelites. So when Paul says that he goes to ta ethne, the peoples, or to the foreskins, That's a shorthand way of saying that he's really going to those Israelites living among non-Israelite majorities. Again, Paul had little to no interest in non-Israelites or Gentiles, including those who believed in Jesus. Paul considered non-Israelite believers to be like branches grafted contrary to nature onto Israel, the true root, and he insulted them thus.
Yes.
I'm just curious, when would you place the inclusion of non-Israelite Gentiles into the Jesus community?
Well, certainly by Constantine. Cuius regio eris religio, right? Constantine declares it the state religion. Well, then they all come pouring in. This is the thing to be. So you're certainly going to have it. There may be some before that, but Paul don't really care about them. Certainly when he gets to Romans 11, he's talking about some non-Israelite Jesus group members. But as I said, he insults them roundly, and it's not his business, and it's not what he's interested in.
One more thing. You should never refer to these peoples, non-Israelites or Gentiles in the ancient world, as being pagans. That would be anachronism. The correct terms are non-Israelites, or maybe Gentiles.
Yes.
Would you say something about the tradition of Paul as apostle to the Gentiles? How does this get going?
This is, you probably heard this before, right? You know about the woman who learned from her mother how to do roasts. And she always used to cut the roast in half and put it in the pot and bun. And one day her kids asked her, why do you always do this? She says, I don't know, because my mother always did this. And so she went to her mother and said, Ma, why did you always cut the roast in half and you put it in? She says, because I didn't have a pot big enough. So what my point is that somewhere something gets started and it just goes on and on and on. The examples I gave about limbo, I mean, maybe those of the younger generation aren't even aware of this, but the older generations, yeah, you remember what an idea this was. It was almost like a dogma. This is what people felt. Same thing with deacons, that these 7 guys in the Acts of the Apostles are deacons. No, the word isn't even used there. And besides, what is described there isn't what, anyways, that's another complex issue. But things get mixed up at some point, and then it's just repeated over and over again at certain